You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. Welcome back to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast that concerns the papers that are written and published in the journal Fire Ecology. Fire Ecology is a journal that's published by Springer and overseen by the Association for Fire Ecology. I am the editor-in-chief of Fire Ecology, and this internationally renowned journal has the privilege of having one of its authors come and talk about their paper. Today we have Scott Franz coming and talking about the paper Bucking the Suppression Status Quo, Incentives to Shift the Wildfire Management Paradigm Around its Natural Ignitions. Scott, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Happy to be here. So my name's Scott Franz. I'm a human dimension specialist and research associate with the Ecological Restoration Institute out of Northern Arizona University, and have a passion for studying all things wildfire, but especially wildfire policy and how that policy ultimately translates into action on the ground to reduce risk and restore resilience.
Well, you sure wrote a good paper for us for Fire Ecology. Give us a quick and dirty thumbnail sketch of what the paper's about.
Yeah, so, we're hearing more and more about the wildfire crisis and what strategies we have to reduce risk, restore resilience in our landscapes. And one growing focus in policy over the past few decades considers this idea of using other than full suppression strategies, or OTFS strategies, as I and others have called them, where managers are using natural ignitions, lightning strikes, and the like to accomplish objectives like fuels reduction. And, the problem is the personal and professional risks perceived by managers are enormous in that context, right? Like the idea that, well, it's much easier, it's more defensible to say, I've done all I can to suppress this fire as quickly and as small as possible. That idea keeps us mired in a suppression status quo. And so the use of these OTFS strategies remains very conservative. And this paper is an exploration of what levers we can pull on in policy, in organizations, in their incentives to shift that risk perception.
This is one of my favorite things to ruminate at night when I'm sitting there in the bed wondering about fire management, is that what are the strategies other than full suppression? And this is a great paper to summarize that. One thing I realize is, why did you end up writing this paper? What was the reasons you thought this paper was important?
This is kind of part 3 of a trilogy that centered on this idea of managing fire with OTFS strategies. The wildfire crisis strategy from the Forest Service highlighted the need to increase the scope and scale of treatments by like an order of magnitude to reduce fuels and our wildfire risk. And research has pointed more and more that wildfire is a crucial tool in the toolbox in order to do so. Like, we're not just going to get there with only prescribed fire and only mechanical thinning. And so first we looked at what wildfire policy, both past and present, allowed for. And that revealed that there's a lot of discretion given to decision makers on the ground to interpret and translate that policy into action. So then we interviewed wildfire professionals on the ground to see how that translation happens from the general direction at the federal level down to the regional application. And that revealed then that the incentives to use OTFS strategies were lacking in the eyes of our participants. Essentially, there's too much risk and too little reward in this context. And so finally, for this study, we were like, well, okay, then what incentives would move that needle? What would get more beneficial fire on the ground? What are the incentives that could increase the use of OTFS strategies? And can a group of wildfire professionals reach consensus on which of those would be the most impactful?
That is a really, really important point. So can you give us a little peek about what your findings were for this paper?
Yeah, we were really encouraged to see that there were a number of incentives that our participants tended toward consensus on. But, for the sake of brevity, I'll focus on a couple. First was capacity. And when I say capacity, I mean like beyond the obvious funding and personnel gaps, right? Like, we always need more money in people and land management. This is capacity in the form of legal justification to use OTFS strategies. So planning documents and assessments that are mandated by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, have been known bottlenecks for decades in wildfire management. And our participants agreed that updated NEPA assessments that say when and where you can leverage these natural ignitions gives the requisite confidence to take necessary risk with OTFS strategies. So they asked, and they really need that document to point to and say, this has been our plan, and this is how we're going to keep the lawsuits at bay on our strategic actions. And, look no further than my home state of Arizona as an example. The Forest Restoration Initiative, or 4FRI, got millions of acres planned under NEPA And that helps the Southwest region to lead the pack on how many acres we're treating and how much fire we get on the ground to do so. What was really, really insightful, though, the most impactful incentive to use OTFS strategies didn't require a stroke of the policy pen at all. More than anything, participants wanted explicit support from leadership, from Washington level leadership, that would increase the use of beneficial fire. And basically just hearing those folks come out and say, we expect you to take smart, necessary risks, and we've got your back when you do so, is such a critical component in fighting against this, let it burn narrative that persists in the public media coverage around wildfire.
Yeah, I totally agree. So what do you think the management implications are behind this paper?
There's a growing chorus of research around wildfire incentives and policies and this paradigm shift, and I hope it starts to help give the right compass heading to managers and policymakers, right? Like, this work is starting to elucidate the levers that we can prioritize at our disposal. What are the types of cash, capacity, commitment that are needed within and across agencies to start moving the needle towards the right heading of living with wildfire as the crisis strategy and the national cohesive strategy we've talked about. And especially now, we're all having to tighten our belts and seeing workforces reduce in those spaces. So how do we get the most bang for our buck to buck the suppression status quo?
I've always thought in the background there should be some legislation somewhere that will take the onus or the consequences of a particular burn and take the responsibility off the fire manager and onto some other thing. But anyways, I want to thank you, Scott, for being around here and giving us a little summary about your paper today. Would you like to recognize any co-authors or funding agencies?
I, of course, want to thank Kat Edgley, my co-author, my advisor, and friend, really, who helped shape this research and this manuscript. Also want to thank the Joint Fire Science Program and their Grin Award that funded this work. And then finally want to thank Melanie Colavito and the Ecological Restoration Institute for helping get this work published and out there in the world, where hopefully it can reach ears, reach eyes, and make a difference.
Well, thank you, Scott, so much for your time for this excellent podcast. Really appreciate it. You listeners, if you are interested in this paper at all, guess what? You can download it for free. That's right, free from our website. Scott has gone and paid the freight for you to have that paper for free. You don't need a subscription. So you can download the paper and get educated on other strategies besides fire suppression. I really appreciate your time, Scott. And please come back again to another Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FireEcology.org.